When I was in high school and when I was in one of my literature classes, we had to read an anthology of great literature. You probably had a similar experience. And when I was in high school in the late 70s, as it was, one of the more popular pieces of literature, which showed up in a lot of anthologies, was a short story called Clothes Make the Man. Maybe you've heard of it. A Frenchman by the name of Henri Duvernay wrote it. And it's only about 2.5 pages long, extremely brief, and you can find it just simply by Googling. It'll pop up as a PDF file. But it's a great little story because it tells the story about 3 crooks who are going to go make a heist in a very rich, wealthy neighborhood. And they have the idea that they have the dumbest, biggest guy in the group is going to be dressed up like a policeman and be kind of patrolling the sidewalk around the neighborhood so that nobody will be suspicious when they hear noises or see people running, because if the policeman's fine, everything's got to be good. So the guy gets his policeman outfit on, and he's out patrolling in the neighborhood. And the story, the way he actually tells it, is masterful. It's so concise, but you get the picture very quickly. He runs into a lieutenant, a bona fide real policeman, and he overcomes his fear to run away, and instead he just walks up and he actually salutes the policeman, and he says, "Wow, that felt pretty good." He thinks that felt great. Look at that. He saluted me back. Look at that. And he begins to feel really pretty good about being in this uniform. And he had looked in the mirror and thought he looked pretty sharp, and he's feeling pretty good about it. So then he sees a little old lady trying to get across the street having trouble. And so he steps up and says, "Can I help you?" Offers his arm and walks her across, not even noticing, Duvernay tells us, the fat purse she's got hanging on her arm. He's not even thinking about that now. He wants to do what he should do. He helps this little old lady across the street. And then he runs into a drunk who starts castigating the policeman and calling him names, and he's offended now that this guy would be casting aspersions on the police, and so he says, "Come with me," and he's going to arrest this drunk, he decides. And in the process of hauling this guy down the street, who shows up but his 2 colleagues who have come over the fence with their bag of loot. And the other friend of theirs sees the 2 who are supposed to be his friends with their bag of loot, and he's so perplexed, and he says, "What's going on here?" And the guy says, "You idiot, what are you doing with that drunk? Let him go." And the robber, now dressed up as a policeman, stops and thinks, "No, this is not right." And the story ends beautifully because he puts his whistle in his mouth, blows his whistle, and he yells, "Crook, stop!" And he tries to arrest his own friends. And that's how the story ends. Now, what Duvernay is doing is he's telling us this story, and it's kind of humorous, and it's rather remarkable, but what he's getting at is clothes make the man. And there's just enough of this reality at work in here for us to say, that's plausible. That's plausible. You could see a person being so imprinted by who he is supposed to be that he becomes that. You see, that's what I'm trying to get at in this discussion about character, is the things that we do when we're living according to God's will, when we're following His law, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. The will of God is not a bad, negative thing. It's a good thing. And when we're doing what God has given us to do, following His law, then we are going to be learning new behaviors. We are going to be practicing habits. We are going to be imprinting things onto our character, which maybe feel a little strange. Just like when Tango, that was the name of the man who put on the police uniform, when he first puts on the uniform, he feels a little strange. It doesn't feel right. But then he starts to get into it, and it becomes more and more part of him. Well, his transformation happens over the course of one evening. But reality is, it takes longer than that, but the picture is very clear nonetheless. What we do shapes who we are. The things I practice become very much who I am. And so my character becomes imprinted into me by my practices and my habits and my doing of God's will, my doing of the law. That's what's going on in this practice of formation. Now, if you're thinking about this, and I hope you are, maybe you're beginning to realize that there are lots of behaviors and lots of forces and lots of things in the world that are impacting us and shaping character. In fact, the reality is that your character, your individual personality, is continually being shaped and formed and manipulated and twisted around by all kinds of forces all around you all the time. Our character is never neutral. And we can't say it's complete, remember, until the day we die. So up until that moment, it's always being shaped and formed, for good or for ill. And what we need to recognize is that in the culture in which we live, there are so many very, very good forces at work, or not good, but very, very effective forces at work at accomplishing their purposes, and they're not always trying to form us into what God would have us to be. Just think about some of those forces that are at work in the world around us. Friends, family members, people we work with, people we go to school with, people we follow in the media, news anchors, people who are writing the news stories, how they write them, what they tell us, politicians, advertisements, arts, literature, music, social media. All of these things are all making an impact on how we think, how we see the world, what we think is right, what we think is wrong, how we think we should function, and it begins to form and shape our character and who we are. We need to be very, very conscious of this in the church. And we need to be very conscious of this, especially when we think about forming people into the Christian faith. Because we have all kinds of threats and forces and other very effective things that are going on out there in the world which are competing with us. All kinds of competition in trying to form character, especially in young people. Because the younger you are, the more malleable is your character, the less it has been entrenched and driven into the way things function. You know that the longer you do something, the more that habit becomes part of you, the harder it is to shake, whether for good or for evil. If you're in the habit of going to church, you'll always go to church, no matter what. You can be on vacation out in the middle of nowhere, there aren't any churches around, you're going to find some way to go to church because it's your habit. You can't shake it. That's a good thing. Or habit can be very negative. Habit of eating too much, or the kind of habits you get into with your routines of not exercising or whatever. Those things can be very negative habits. They're hard to break. That's the reality with things that you do. When you practice them for years and decades, they just become part of who you are. Now, a child hasn't had the chance to lay down those kinds of heavy tracks. And so they're very malleable, very susceptible to be formed and shaped. And the world around us is very committed to shaping and forming our children. And they do it very well, very well. Great example in our own recent past is the stunning success of the what's called the gay rights lobby or the homosexual lobby. When I was growing up as a child 40 years ago, and in my high school years, well, man, back then, you still didn't talk about that stuff. No one accepted it. And in the space of just a couple generations, homosexuality has gone from being vilified and rejected to becoming mainstream and accepted to the point now where it's just a foregone conclusion. They have the rights everybody else does. They can get married. No big deal. And so we're changing definitions of all kinds of things. We're shifting the discussion simply because, well, that's what's right. But wait a minute. Who decided it was right? Well, how did this happen? How did this shift take place? Well, it took place because the gay rights lobby knew what they were doing. They knew how to shape minds. They knew how to claim the discussion. They knew how to instill new behaviors and new ways of thinking because, after all, can't we choose anybody we want to love? Who are we to tell somebody they can't love the one they want to love? And these things sound so good and so right. And we say them enough, and we hear them enough, we begin to believe it. And when you have sympathetic characters in literature and in art and in the media, it begins to look really good. So that's just one example of how character can be fundamentally shifted simply by habits long practiced. And the world is good at this. The church, I think, has a long history and a long heritage of being good at this, but we're losing some of our credibility in doing this well. And we've maybe forgotten some of the things we need to remember if we're going to have success in doing this. We need to pay a little more attention to actually working to shape character. It's very interesting that St. Paul actually talks about this. He talks about it with Timothy, his young protege, the young pastor Timothy. And he encourages Timothy in one of his letters to the young pastor. He says, Timothy, I want you to keep on cultivating the gifts that were given to you, and I want you to use them well because they were in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and now they're in you. Well, how'd they get in Timothy? Obviously, Grandma Lois and Mother Eunice knew what they were doing. And they were working hard to build into Timothy these same sort of character traits, carving them into him, teaching him how he's supposed to operate, helping him learn what it means to be an upright man. And how did he learn that? Probably by doing chores, probably by being disciplined when things didn't go quite right, by being encouraged when things did go right, and teaching him to do the right sort of things. As a child, I can remember being forced to write thank you notes against my will. Didn't like it, but it's the right thing to do, and you got to do it, and you just do it. And you get to the point then as an adult, you realize this is just what you do. Well, where'd you learn that? Someone had to teach it to you, and they taught it to you sometimes in rather unpleasant situations. It's not always easy. As a grandfather now, I'm living through potty training again with my grandkids and being part of that. Well, how does a child learn these things? Habits. Practice. You run them to the bathroom, you teach them, you tell them, you praise them, you help them remember what they need to do, and you just do it again and again and again and again, and eventually it catches on, and it becomes second nature, it becomes part of how we do things. That's how character is formed. It's through those habits and the practices and the doing things. Now, this has implications for how we teach. This has implications for how we do a lot of things in our homes and in our churches. And we need to maybe pay a little more attention to the ramifications and the consequences of the kinds of behaviors and habits we're laying down. There's a rather loaded phrase which comes from the Middle Ages, which is lex orandi, lex credendi. And it's a nice Latin phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, which simply means that the law of praying is the law of believing. Law of praying, orandi, is the law of believing. In other words, what it's saying is the way that you worship shapes how you believe. And it's true. It's true. The way that you pray, the way that you worship, the way you're taught to read the Bible, the way that you think about God because of what people do around you shapes what you believe. Another way to say this is if you worship like a Pentecostal, you will start to believe like a Pentecostal. And if you worship like a Latin Mass Catholic, you will begin to believe like a Latin Mass Catholic. And there's truth to this. Truth that maybe we find a little unsettling, but we need to pay a little more attention to the habits we're laying down by the way we do things because it shapes how we think. And this has a lot to do with catechesis too, or teaching the faith. How do we do this? Do we just tell people to write down on a piece of paper how they feel about God when they're sitting out on a nice sunny day and share their feelings? Well, there's a place for that maybe. But if that's the depth of our catechesis and all we learn to do is explore our feelings about God, maybe we're not really driving in the character we think we are doing. Maybe we're not really imprinting. There's a place, I would argue, for things like memorization and learning things by rote. Because it's not just empty thoughts, it becomes imprinted into us. It becomes part of our very brain structure, frankly, and becomes part of who we are, our character. That's not small. That's really important. We in the church need to pay a little more attention, I think, and be a lot more deliberate about the kind of tracks we're laying down in the lives of our children and the lives of our adults. What are we teaching them to think about God? How are we shaping their character? How are they learning to function? Luther got this. He absolutely got this. When you read in the large catechism, in the Ten Commandments especially, he talks often about teach young people to do these things. And he teaches them to do this by memory, by rote. He wants people to do things by habit. He says instilling habits into young people is good. Teaching people to memorize stuff is right because it shapes them into being right kind of people. Luther gets this. And in fact, in the same large catechism, when he's talking about the Apostles' Creed, he actually says that the creed, the good news of what Jesus has done for us, was given to us so that we can do the Ten Commandments. He's given us forgiveness so that we can do His will, do His law. And when we do His law, we're practicing these right behaviors, we're practicing these right habits, we're learning to go to church, we're learning to say the creed, we're learning to say the Lord's Prayer by memory, we're learning all kinds of Bible verses. This all becomes imprinted in who we are, and we learn to function the right way. So when we learn to say, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and we learn to say please and thank you, that becomes imprinted in who we are, becomes part of our character. And when we learn how to worship God the way that God intends us to worship Him, receiving what He gives through word and sacrament, speaking back to Him our confession, speaking back to Him our thanks and praise, this becomes imprinted into who we are, becomes part of our character. These things matter. Now, Scripture gives us these great examples, like we have Lois and Eunice imprinting Timothy. And we also have Jesus imprinting the 12. Think about the time he spent with them over the course of his ministry, over those years just hanging out with those disciples, all that they learned simply by being with him, seeing how he prayed, seeing how he did things, seeing how he talked, this made an impact on them. It formed and shaped their character. And there are negative examples. We could think about how David dropped the ball with Absalom and didn't imprint character, and how Absalom goes off the rails. Or we think about how Abraham imprinted Isaac for good, worship of God, and not so good. Abraham's lie about his wife not really being his wife, Isaac does the same thing. And so from father to son, things get passed along, sometimes by intention, often just by force of habits and practices and seeing things going on. I want us to think a little bit more carefully about this and to be a little bit more intentional and deliberate about what kind of character are we shaping? What kind of habits are we doing? What kind of tracks are we laying down? We need to think a little bit more about this and work a little bit more diligently about this, especially in light of the world around us trying to lead us astray. And then we can become more and more the kind of people that God has called us to be. But we'll think about that a little bit more next time. For now, I want you to pause and think about character's formation and how it happens in our own lives and in the lives of some of the scriptural characters we've been thinking about. God's blessings on your study.